would appear the wind's stronger than I thought. Hello again. In a previous video, which I'll link at the end of this one, I explored reasons why cyclists don't or can't use cycle paths. The whole subject is fraught with anger, conflict and emotion, which basically delays the massive transition that needs to happen to make all sides happy. In that video, I finished with imploring motorists to be patient while the next cycling network is developed. I say next because the majority of roads that cyclists are told they shouldn't be on were originally built for cyclists and horses, our previous network. That said, many cyclists don't want to be on those roads these days and would rather have properly segregated cycle routes for the sake of safety. I refer here to a cycling network, so what do I mean by that? Look at the map of any town or city and what you see is a vast network of streets and roads linking shops, schools, places of work, places of leisure and residential areas. Each town has its own network like a vast spider's web, and they all have roads interlinking with the next town, creating a massive national network for vehicles. We can only succeed with the stated aim of creating an environment where people are happy to choose an active way rather than using a vehicle if we strive to create a cycling network rather than the piecemeal patchwork and sometimes pathetically planned provision of cycle routes, paths and lanes. My view then is that the way we're going about making this happen means it's actually never going to happen if something doesn't change. Take the example of a new length of dual carriageway or motorway. It'll be planned, funded and built across many different local authority areas. You don't see sections of it missing, some with just one lane while others have three, the road surface constantly changing along this newly laid stretch and different parts of it being built at different times. Yet this represents how it appears to be with the delivery of cycling infrastructure, in spite of a national desire by government for this provision to happen. Separate adjoining authorities have different ideas on what a bike path should look like, even what colour it should be, let alone whether it should be built at all, and where they rank in each authority's list of priorities, which is often a political decision rather than based on actual need. As part of my research for this video, I'm off to have a cup of coffee in this fantastic new cafe down by Shoreham Port to meet a local road safety campaigner, Adam Bronkhorst, and get a few details about the area and its issues. Now, I personally don't have the need to use cycle lanes at home where I live, so I'm using Brighton and Hove area as an example. This is the one place where I do use cycle lanes when I'm down visiting my son. Not only is it a busy urban and suburban area, it's a major tourist destination and therefore really should have better infrastructure than most. From a tourism perspective, the area is crying out for fantastic cycle routes, stretching from Worthing to Eastbourne with Brighton in the middle. But here we see one of the enormous obstacles in the way of cycling networks ever happening. In this local area you have county councils, district councils, borough councils, parish councils, all with their own views and political bias, which means, as I referred to earlier, that decisions are made without any reference to what's going on next door. In the direction of Worthing from here, and particularly through Shoreham here, attempting to cycle to Brighton Pier, which tourists in the area might choose to do on a nice sunny day in the summer, you're still forced to use this stretch of the A259, which inevitably results in most tourists in that situation getting in a car and adding to the traffic up in Brighton, and also underutilises the cycle paths provided when you reach the boundary of Brighton and Hove City Council. For quite a while now in Brighton and Hove, there's a fantastic cycle hire scheme, which has the second largest usage in the UK outside London. However, much later the adjoining council, which serves Worthing up to the boundary of Hove, they embraced the cycle scheme. But surely though, if it was to serve the public properly, it would be an extension of the existing scheme, allowing somebody in this area to get a bike go up to Brighton for the day, knowing they can leave it at any hub up by the pier. But no, they look no further than their own boundary. Not a criticism of them specifically, it's just what they all do. It could have been a big boost towards establishing cycling networks along this tourist coastal region, but sadly political bureaucracy meant that it failed. So you can see coming off the main road, any cyclist, if there weren't others that you could follow and realise you're going the right way, might wonder where the hell do I go now, because you have to get off your bike and walk through the locks. Another issue, of course, here is that this particular part of the cycle route across the coast is actually on private land, and that's why you won't see any cycle paths marked for a while. It's private land, and thank God you could actually come through these locks, because the alternative for a lot of cyclists who don't fancy cycling in heavy traffic is cycling in heavy traffic. So these are issues we have with such a disjointed decision-making system. So now I'll turn to Brighton and Hove specifically. It's a local authority that over the decades has been more progressive than most regarding this subject, but it still has been unable to provide a real cycling network across its jurisdiction, although plenty of improvements are actually afoot. So let's have a poodle around and see what we have. It's interesting as well when you talk about the opposition to cycle paths. One of them that Adam mentioned, which made me smile, was that we're in a country that rains a lot, and why do you need all these cycle paths? Because it's always raining, no one wants to cycle in the rain. Well, you know, if we took that to its full extent, then why don't we rip up all the pedestrian footpaths, because nobody wants to go out walking in the rain. It's a absolutely nonsense argument really, but that's what we have to put up with. So we have facing Shoreham, the traffic lights here right at the edge of Brighton and Hove's jurisdiction, with Hove Lagoon on the left. And as you'll hear from in a minute, there are plans to increase the cycling infrastructure along the coast, but again, because of this disjointed nature of the system, they can only take it as far as these traffic lights, in spite of the fact that the road gets fairly heavy with traffic further on. Brighton and Hove have had this seafront cycle path for over 20 years. At the time it was a fairly progressive move by the local authority. But essentially, it's a bit of reddish coloured paint with a few white lines on the footpath that was previously used by pedestrians. In the current context of cycling infrastructure, it just isn't enough anymore. For years, many local authorities have made token gestures and regarded these as cycling infrastructure. Others, like Brighton and Hove, did something more adventurous years ago, but have rested on their laurels, assuming they've done their bit. This particular section has two-way traffic, and anyone a little nervous possibly wouldn't use it at all, because the distance between you and a bike coming the other way is quite narrow. For some reason, it took the COVID pandemic and the apparent increase of people out on their bikes to make the local authority look at alternatives. The end result was making part of this cycle path one way only and creating an additional path for cycles moving in the other direction by taking a section of the road. This resulted, as you might expect, in opposition, in spite of the fact I've never seen this particular section clogged with traffic, and the reduction of the width for cars I don't imagine would have caused massive problems. As a result, a section of it was taken out, and a section from the Grand Hotel all the way up to here at the Hove Lagoon traffic light was left out of the scheme, only now to be added back into the scheme sometime this year. As you can see now, this stretch has moved alongside the sea and is actually a bit wider, But you know, you've got pedestrian area on the left, pedestrian area on the right. You're going to get the inevitable crossing over, which you know, means it isn't separated. But now you have the classic narrow strip with just a white painted line separating you from traffic, albeit again not heavy traffic. But where the heck do the bikes coming in the other direction go? Doesn't seem to be anywhere for them. And that's why it's important that they do what they do by directing the bicycle traffic on a new cycle lane along the main road that we've just come off, which is what's going to happen. A little highlight for me along here, as you would have seen in a video I did last year when I rode along here towards Ditchling Beacon, is this is the home of David Gilmour, a particular rock guitar hero of mine from Pink Floyd. And when I went past, he was actually sitting in that window. Too cold for it today. So as we come back off the seafront and back to the main road, where the improved scheme that was put on during lockdown comes to an abrupt end. So later on this year, the bit that was taken out of the scheme because of complaints at the time is now being put back in the scheme, and will continue along there now until we get to the traffic lights you saw earlier at Hove Lagoon. So this is one of the north to south roads in the area, which potentially should be joining two different east to west cycle routes. This particular bit is ideal. It's separated from moving vehicles by a curb and parked vehicles. But we do have that horrible possibility of a car door being opened just as you're passing. The consequences of that are obvious. Once you get to the junction at the top, however, and you're not a confident cyclist, it's a case of where the hell do I go now? And this is what I mean by cycling network. It needs to be joining another cycling lane. Yes, the lane continues up after these traffic lights, but there's a lot going on. This is a main street here. This gives fuel to the people who argue against cycle lanes that nobody's using them. Well, the fact is that if somebody who's not confident realizes that this actually is a dead end for them because they won't cycle along this main road, then of course they're not going to use it. It needs to be part of a cycling network, simple as that. And to a lot of people, although this is a really good cycle lane separated by curb and parked cars, for a lot of cyclists it's a waste of time because it's taken them to somewhere that they can't then ride their bike.
A good cycling network doesn't need to be the vast spider's web like our current road network. It's somewhere like Brighton and Hove, simple ladder shapes with long east to west routes linked with several north to south routes. The key thing is they need to be linked and they need to be substantial and safe.
It really is a joy cycling along here knowing it is just one way. And really, you know, we are kind of just towards the end of the rush hour. And I mean, these cars are stopped here purely because the lights are on red. There's no great build-up of vehicles at all. You know, the extra bit of road that's been taken away to provide that is really not causing an issue. The only long-term issue is that the division between the cycles and the cars is only these kind of plastic-looking bollards. I rather hope that something a bit more substantial is provided in the end. Generally speaking, it's still a line of paint, but at least there is a visual vertical separator rather than just the paint on the road, which helps. But here we come to the nonsense of it all again, to the point where suddenly this fantastic new one-way cycle lane comes to an abrupt end again. So what's that all about? As far as I can understand, the bus companies complained and the section from the pier in the near distance ahead of me to the Grand Hotel was taken out of the scheme. which is a shame. It just means that once again we have a disjointed system. Now right now, it's not the end of the world, but when we get nearer the pier, and in particularly in the summer, a bigger issue then appears. So we're now approaching the pier, and it's hard to picture this time of year, but in the summer there is literally hundreds and hundreds of people milling around here. The only real solution for safety is to get off your bike. With that many of them, you can't really see where you're going in such a crowd, and they're wandering into the cycle lane. It's just a recipe for disaster. And in my view, there needs to be some way of separation. Having said that, there are some more plans afoot for that area ahead of me here. There's a great project called the Valley Gardens project, an area called the Level, which is away inland along there, where most of the traffic that's coming from the east comes to this roundabout, then goes up in that direction. And there's been 3 phases. Phase 1 and 2 have been done, providing safe cycle routes along there. It's referred to as the Valley Gardens project. You'll see from this image of what phase 3 will look like, which is the development of this roundabout, partly creating a T-junction with traffic lights and completely changing the routing of traffic so that on the right as you look, the traffic is going 2-way, and the traffic which goes round to the left, as you can see there, that's all going to be shut off, and that is going to be cycle lane and pedestrians only, and will literally form a link, finally a link, remember that word, essential for networks, to the existing cycle lane along the seafront. The good thing for me from the image is that the barriers I'm standing by now with the cycle lane behind me, the image which shows the finished article shows the cycle lane the other side of the barrier away from the pedestrians. If that's the case, then that solves the problem in the summer that I referred to. Now this has been improved in the last few years. The old existing cycle lane that we were on earlier on, 2-way, very narrow, much wider, and amusingly to me, I don't know whether it's because it's the Green Party, but it's coloured green. The comment I made earlier about nobody seems to know what colour cycle lane should be. It probably would help if it was all a uniform colour. And signposting is one of the issues we have for cycling networks. I know there's a cycle path called the Undercliff, which is a fantastic cycle path at the low level, keeping away from the A259. It just seems a little bit awkward to find. We know it's down there on the right. The cycle path here is telling me to go double back on myself, whereas the sensible route is to actually come down here where that bike's coming from. The cycle route just wasn't signposted or marked to come down here, but there it is. That gate there is the route to the path that takes you all along the coast away from the 259, called the Undercliff. I mean, the inclusion of those gates makes it look like are we allowed? Is it private? Luckily we've got this painted on the path here that lets you realise it is a path for pedestrians and cyclists. The good news is, part of the local developments are that there's going to be lots of changes on the beach the other side of this concrete. Part of that provision will be improved pedestrian and cyclist access from Madeira Drive through the marina, making the Undercliff path feel a little less like a secret path that you might come across if you're lucky. Much of the improvements I've talked about so far seem like no-brainers to me, but with something like this next one, I can kind of understand why it causes conflict. So you've just seen me cycle along this brilliant cycle path along Madeira Drive, which is at the low level alongside the sea, parallel with the main A259 up here, which is much higher up and much busier. Funds have been applied for and granted to create a cycle lane along the stretch from the pier along the 259, and opponents will immediately point to the fact that a current path exists down there that's perfectly adequate. But to justify the new lane, we need to focus on the fact that we're not just talking about tourists who want to bimble along the beach and visit the marina. There are plenty of people who live up here who need to get to work in the smaller towns along the coast here. And as you can see, it's a hell of a way down to carry a bike, only to be back up at road level again soon by pushing it up here. I imagine though that particular development is causing a fair bit of controversy. We have to change the process so that the limitations of a council's physical boundary and this particular year's spending budget doesn't have such enormous influence on the type and amount of cycling infrastructure we have. A process that doesn't have spending on that curtailed by other local spending priorities, or changed because a different political party takes overall control of the council or tactically changes the plan due to political pressure locally in order to stay in power. I've used Brighton and Hove purely as an example. The issues are nationwide, and to be fair, they are more progressive than most. But to be honest, if the current Green Party controlled council here was to change control at the next local election, you could see priorities and plans change again here. The very reason why we're unlikely to see the cycling network the country needs under the current system of planning, funding and implementing. I'm sure you have an opinion or two on this, so let me know what you think on the comments below. I hope it's been of interest to you. If so, please click on the thumbs up below and subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate that. In the meantime, it's cheerio from sunny Brighton, windy Brighton, and I'll see you soon.